Jiho Seo, the most feared alpha in South Korea's criminal underworld, was on his knees in his own corridor, and Paul Carson was pretending not to see it. Not literally. Jiho would never kneel. But his palm was flat against the wall beside Paul's head, his black-suited frame blocking the only exit, and the man who had never once asked for anything in his life was asking now, wordlessly, through every rigid line of his body, "Don't go." Paul's roller bag sat at his feet. The cab was outside. The debt receipt was folded in his breast pocket, stamp settled in full in red ink that should have felt like a victory. It felt like a door closing on the wrong side of him. 3 months, Paul thought. 3 months in this man's world and I still can't read him. That was a lie. He could read Jiho Seo perfectly. That was the problem. He looked up, because Paul Carson did not look away, not from danger, not from alpha posturing, not even from this, and met eyes that were doing something they had never done in 90 days of cold, controlled coexistence. Jiho's eyes were afraid. The realization hit Paul somewhere behind his sternum, sharp and unwelcome, like a key turning in a lock he didn't know he had. His sense suppressant was failing. He could feel it, the slow, terrible warmth of his own omega instincts surfacing through 3 years of chemical discipline, drawn out by the one scent in this city that had always, infuriatingly, felt like the opposite of danger. Amber. Cold iron. And underneath it, home. Paul's jaw tightened. He had survived 80 million won of someone else's recklessness. He had survived 3 months inside the Seo Syndicate's gilded machine. He had survived falling for a man built entirely out of walls. He was not going to survive being asked to stay. He lifted his chin, dark chestnut hair, rose-brown eyes, crimson shirt the only warm color in this entire black marble kingdom, and said, with every ounce of composure he had left, "Move, Jiho." Jiho Seo did not move. Instead, quietly, more quietly than Paul had ever heard him speak, he said 4 words that unraveled 90 days of careful distance in a single breath. "Who said you could go?" The cab was still waiting. Paul's hand was still on his bag. And the only man he had ever met who looked at him like he was something worth understanding, not managing, not handling, not designating, was blocking the door like he had finally run out of ways to pretend he didn't care. This, Paul thought, with furious, helpless clarity, is going to be a problem. But to understand why Paul Carson, the sharpest omega in Seoul's financial world, was standing in a Mafia lord's corridor with his suppressants failing and his exit plan collapsing, we have to go back to the night his brother destroyed everything. Back to 80 million won, a phone call at 2 a.m., and the moment Paul walked into the lion's den not as a captive, but as the only person in the room who wasn't afraid of the lion. The call came at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, which was, Paul would later think, exactly the kind of hour at which a person's life decides to stop cooperating. He was still awake. He was always still awake at 2 a.m., laptop open, Seoul's skyline burning cold and indifferent through his apartment window, when his phone lit up with a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. He answered. "Mr. Carson." The voice on the other end was courteous in the way that sharpened things were courteous, precise, and capable of cutting. "My name is Hyun-jin. I represent the Seo organization. I'm calling regarding your brother, Daniel Carson, and an outstanding debt of 80 million won." Paul set down his coffee. "Daniel," he said, very calmly, "doesn't have 80 million won." "No," Hyun-jin agreed pleasantly. "He doesn't. That is, in fact, the problem." Daniel was 4 years younger than Paul and had spent most of those years treating the gap like a safety net. Paul had been covering for him since their mother's funeral, quietly, efficiently, the way Paul did everything, paying the smaller debts, smoothing the rougher edges, translating his brother's chaos into something manageable. He had told himself it was love. He had told himself Daniel would eventually level out. What Daniel had actually done was borrow 80 million won from the most dangerous private lending network in South Korea, then board a flight to Busan without telling anyone, leaving behind a studio apartment, 3 Max credit cards, and a handwritten note that said only, "I'm sorry, Hyung. I'll fix it." He would not fix it. Paul had known Daniel his entire life. Daniel did not fix things. Daniel created the kind of damage that required someone else to be competent on his behalf. Paul stood at his window for exactly 90 seconds after the call ended, long enough to feel the full weight of it, not long enough to let it become panic, and then he opened his laptop and started doing math. The math did not cooperate. 80 million won was not a number Paul could cover. Not liquidly, not quickly, not without dismantling the financial architecture he had spent 6 years building from nothing in a city that had never owed him anything. He ran the numbers 4 times because he was Paul Carson, and Paul Carson did not accept the first answer. The fourth answer was the same as the first. He couldn't math his way out of this one. It was, genuinely, the most unsettling realization he'd had in years. By the time he looked up from his screen, a black car had been parked outside his building for 40 minutes. He knew because he had been watching it. He put on his jacket, the charcoal one, the one that read professional rather than afraid, and went downstairs. Hyunjin was leaner than his voice suggested, with watchful eyes and the particular stillness of someone trained to observe. He handed Paul a business card with a single address printed on it and said the car was available whenever Mr. Carson was ready. Paul looked at the card. He looked at the car. He thought about Daniel's note, still sitting on his kitchen counter. "I'm sorry, Hyung," in the handwriting of a man who had always known someone would come. "Now," Paul said. "I'm ready now." The Seo estate was in Gangnam, not the Gangnam of tourist photographs and bright storefronts, but the quieter, older money that sat behind walls and said nothing about itself. The building was all dark stone and deliberate silence, lit from within by the kind of lighting that cost more than Paul's monthly rent. Jiho Seo was waiting in a room with no windows. Paul registered this immediately: no natural light, no exterior view, one entrance. A room designed so that the person sitting behind the desk controlled every variable. He filed the information, walked to the chair across from that desk, and sat without being invited. Jiho looked up from the file open in front of him. He was younger than Paul had expected, mid-30s, dark-haired, with a face arranged into an expression of such complete neutrality it could only be deliberate. He wore black. He wore it like architecture. He studied Paul for a moment with the particular attention of someone accustomed to reading people the way Paul read balance sheets, looking for the number that didn't fit. Then he closed the file and made his offer. 3 months. Paul would serve as the syndicate's internal financial auditor, full archive access, full scope, no interference. Concurrently, he would provide social cover as Jiho's contracted Omega companion, satisfying a grandfather's inheritance clause that required the heir to appear bonded. No real bonding. No real intimacy. Controlled appearances, a convincing performance, nothing beyond what Paul could agree to in writing. In exchange, Daniel's debt, cleared in full. No interest. No consequences to either Carson. No coercion, Jiho said. His voice was low and even, the voice of a man who had never needed volume. Just consequences, if you decline. Paul looked at him for a long moment. He was looking for the lie. He found, instead, a man who appeared to have no interest in pretending. He picked up the pen. His hand didn't shake. Paul arrived at the Seo estate the following morning with one suitcase, his work laptop, and the particular internal stillness of a man who had already grieved the version of events where this didn't happen. He did not bring much. He had learned early that the less you carried into uncertain territory, the less there was to use against you. Hyunjin met him at the entrance with the energy of someone conducting a very efficient, very impersonal intake assessment. He walked Paul through the estate at a pace that suggested he had done this before and expected it to be the last time, the kind of tour designed to orient, not welcome. The estate was enormous and immaculate in the way that places were immaculate when a small army of silent staff maintained them around the clock. Every surface reflected light. Every corridor smelled of expensive diffusers laid over something older and more territorial, the accumulated scent of too many alphas in too close a space, softened but not erased by industrial-grade suppressant systems running through the ventilation. Paul's Omega biology catalogued this automatically, the way it always did in high-alpha environments, and he told it, the way he always did, to mind its own business. The suite assigned to him was on the 3rd floor, large, tasteful, and decorated with the soulless precision of a luxury hotel room. Everything matched. Nothing meant anything. There was a schedule printed and placed on the desk: meals, appearances, designated work hours, a weekly briefing with Hyunjin. Paul read it once, set it aside, and began quietly rearranging the furniture. He moved the desk to face the door rather than the wall. He did not work with his back exposed. He repositioned the lamp for proper task lighting. He opened the curtains fully because he needed natural light to think, and whoever had staged this room had apparently never worked a 14-hour day in their life. By the time he was done, the suite looked less like a display and more like a place a person actually inhabited. Hyunjin reappeared in the doorway, looked at the rearranged room, and said nothing. His expression suggested he was updating some internal file. The archive, Paul said. I'll need full access today. Mr. Seo indicated you'd have access from tomorrow. Today, Paul said pleasantly, and waited. Hyunjin studied him for a moment with those careful, measuring eyes. Then he produced an access card from his jacket pocket and set it on the desk with the quiet deliberateness of a man conceding a minor point while reserving judgment on the larger ones. The server room is on the basement level, he said. Try not to break anything. Paul did not break anything. He did, however, spend the next 48 hours taking the syndicate's financial archive apart with a focused, almost meditative intensity that had made him exceptional at his job and difficult to be friends with. The archive was extensive and, on its surface, clean, the kind of clean that took real effort to manufacture. Most auditors would have been satisfied. Paul was not most auditors. He followed numbers the way a physician followed symptoms, not looking for what was there, but for what was conspicuously, carefully absent. He found the first trail on hour 6. A supply chain subsidiary with billing cycles that didn't align with any legitimate operational calendar. The second by hour 19, a dormant account receiving microtransfers too small and too regular to be accidental. The third was the most elegant, a payroll ghost, a name attached to a salary that had been paid monthly for 3 years to a person who, as far as Paul could determine, had never existed. He compiled everything into a preliminary report, structured, sourced, annotated, and sent it to the internal briefing address Hyunjin had provided at exactly 11:47 p.m. He was still at his desk when the knock came. He knew it was Jiho before he opened the door. He wasn't sure how he knew, the weight of it, maybe, or the silence that preceded it, the particular quality of stillness that seemed to travel ahead of the man like a warning system. He opened the door and found Jiho standing in the corridor in a dark shirt, jacket gone, the printed report in one hand, reading it with the focused attention Paul usually only saw directed at a screen. Jiho looked up. He looked at Paul. He looked back at the report. You missed one, he said. Paul's eyes went flat. It was not the response of a man who had been awake for most of 48 hours and had just located 3 sophisticated embezzlement schemes that the syndicate's own people had apparently walked past for years. It was not, Paul thought with precise and crystalline clarity, the appropriate thing to say. He took the report from Jiho's hand. He closed the door. Not hard. Not dramatically. Simply and finally, the way you closed the door when the conversation was over. He was back at his desk within 60 seconds. He found the 4th trail by 4 a.m., a real estate holding company, 3 shell layers deep, bleeding money into an account registered to a name Paul recognized from the family dinner seating chart Hyunjin had sent him. He added it to the report. He did not send it until morning. He slept for 2 hours first, on principle. Some things were about the work. Some things were about something else entirely. The full briefing came 3 days after Paul's arrival, delivered by Hyunjin in the estate's main conference room with the calm, methodical energy of a man reading from a document he had memorized and did not personally enjoy. Paul listened without interrupting. He had learned that interrupting Hyunjin mid-briefing produced the same result as interrupting a loading screen. It changed nothing and cost you time. The situation, stripped of the careful language Hyunjin used to present it, was this. Seo Changwon, Jiho's grandfather, 83 years old, syndicate patriarch, and by all available evidence the single most stubborn human being currently drawing breath in South Korea, had written a succession clause into the organizational charter 20 years ago requiring the heir to be formally recognized as bonded to an omega before assuming full leadership control. His reasoning, Hyunjin explained with the expression of someone who had been asked to explain this many times, was rooted in a belief that an unbonded alpha at the head of a criminal organization was an unstable alpha, and an unstable alpha made bad decisions that got people killed. He's not entirely wrong, Paul said. Hyunjin blinked. No, he agreed, apparently surprised. He isn't. The problem was that Jiho was 34, unbonded by choice, and the grandfather's health was deteriorating in the specific way that accelerated timelines. A rival branch of the family, led by Jiho's cousin, a man named Seo Daewon, whom Paul had already identified as the owner of the Shell real estate account from his fourth embezzlement trail, was watching the succession clause with the patient interest of someone who intended to use it. If Jiho did not present a credible Omega bond at the upcoming family assembly in 6 weeks, Daewon's branch would formally contest his leadership. The resulting power struggle would be, Hyunjin said carefully, destabilizing. Paul translated this without difficulty. People would get hurt. The organization would fracture. 3 years of whatever Jiho had been quietly holding together would come apart at a seam his grandfather had sown 2 decades ago out of tradition and, arguably, good instinct. So he needs a performance, Paul said. A convincing one. The grandfather is sharp, even now. The family will be watching. And I'm convincing. Hyunjin looked at him with an expression that was almost, in the dim light of the conference room, something like respect. You found 4 embezzlement trails in 48 hours that our internal team missed for 3 years, he said. Mr. Seo believes you are capable of whatever you commit to. Paul thought about this. It was, he recognized, the most honest compliment the arrangement had produced so far. Fine, he said. Send me the family dossiers. I want to know everyone who will be in that room before I walk into it. The family dinner was held 12 days later at a private restaurant in Apgujeong that the Seo family had apparently owned for 30 years. Paul wore charcoal, dark enough to be serious, not black enough to look like he was trying to match Jiho, which he was not going to do under any circumstances, and spent the car ride reviewing faces and names from the dossiers he had memorized. Jiho sat beside him in the back seat and said nothing, which was his primary mode of communication and one Paul had, against his will, begun to find almost restful. The restaurant was full of people who looked at Paul with the particular calibrated attention of individuals assessing a variable. He looked back at each of them with the pleasant, impenetrable expression he used in high-stakes client meetings, interested, unrevealing, impossible to read. Seo Chang-won sat at the head of the table. He was smaller than Paul had imagined from the dossier, but his eyes were precise and heavy and moved over Paul with the thoroughness of an old man who had spent decades determining who was real and who was performing. Paul met his gaze directly and held it for exactly long enough to communicate that he was not afraid, then looked away first as a courtesy. He felt the grandfather watching him for the rest of the first course. It was during the second course that Jiho placed his hand at the small of Paul's back. It was a small gesture. Socially legible, contextually appropriate. Jiho leaning slightly toward him to murmur something about the cousin 2 seats down, hand resting against Paul's spine in the easy, habitual way of men who touched each other often. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It landed like a struck match. Paul's nervous system registered it before his brain had the chance to apply any of its considerable management skills, a current of warmth running up his spine, his Omega instincts surfacing with sudden, mortifying interest from beneath 3 weeks of freshly applied suppressants, his body producing an entirely unrequested and deeply inconvenient opinion about Jiho Seo's hand. He reached for his water glass. He drank. He continued the dinner with perfect composure. In the car home, Jiho sat beside him in the same silence as before, and Paul stared at the city moving past the window and conducted an internal conversation with his own biology that was extensive, unflattering, and entirely one-sided. He was furious at himself in the specific, precise way he reserved for problems he could not solve with data. His suppressants, he decided, needed adjusting. It was the most rational explanation. It was almost certainly not the right one. The numbers told stories. They always did. This was the thing civilians never understood about financial work, that a balance sheet was never just arithmetic. It was a record of decisions, and decisions were a record of character. And if you knew how to read the sequence of what a person chose to fund and what they chose to cut and what they quietly moved so no one would look directly at it, you knew something true about them that they had never intended to share. Paul had been reading people through their numbers for 6 years. He was very good at it. He had learned, early and efficiently, not to be surprised by what he found. The Seo syndicate's finances surprised him. He had expected the architecture of a criminal organization. Money flowing in through illegitimate channels, laundered through legitimate ones, extracted at the top for the benefit of the people with names on the charter. He had expected waste, excess, the financial signature of men who took because they could. What he found instead was something considerably more complicated. The syndicate's legitimate holdings were extensive: construction, logistics, hospitality, a small private hospital in Mapo that Paul initially flagged as a laundering vehicle before he looked more closely and realized it ran at a consistent loss that no laundering operation would tolerate. The hospital served low-income families in the surrounding district. It had been operating this way for 11 years. The loss was absorbed, every quarter, without comment, from a discretionary account that traced back to Jiho's personal finances rather than the organizational budget. Paul sat with this information for a long time before moving on. The deeper he went, the clearer the picture became, and the picture was this: somewhere between 8 and 11 years ago, depending on which subsidiary you were tracking, the SEO organization had been significantly larger, significantly more aggressive, and significantly less careful about the human cost of its operations. The contraction was not accidental. It was deliberate, methodical, and had been executed with the kind of patience that required someone to absorb enormous internal pressure over a very long period without breaking. The father's era was documented in the earlier records. Seo Jun-hyuk, dead 4 years now, whose financial decision-making suggested a man who confused scale with strength and movement with strategy. He had expanded into territories that cost more to hold than they generated. He had made alliances that created liabilities. He had borrowed, in the organizational sense, against futures that didn't materialize. Jiho had inherited the debt. Not money, something worse. An empire shaped by someone else's recklessness, populated by hundreds of employees and affiliate families whose livelihoods were threaded through the organization's continued function, and a cousin waiting at the perimeter for the first sign of structural failure. Paul pulled the employee welfare records. Medical coverage, housing subsidies, education funds for dependents. All of it maintained, all of it quietly expanded over the past 4 years, funded from the same deliberate, unglamorous reallocation of resources that had slowly transformed the syndicate from something predatory into something that was, if not legitimate, at least trying in a direction Paul had no clean word for. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of the archive room for a full minute. Jiho Seo was not holding a criminal empire together. He was holding a community together that happened to have a criminal empire as its founding structure, and he was doing it with both hands and no acknowledgement and apparently no interest in anyone knowing. Paul found this deeply inconvenient. It was past midnight when he heard the door open. He didn't look up. He had learned that the estate staff moved silently and purposefully and required no acknowledgement, and continued working through the logistics subsidiary's reconciliation records. A coffee appeared at the edge of his desk. Black, no sugar, the way he had taken it every morning since arriving, which he had not mentioned to anyone. He looked up. Jiho set his own cup down across the desk, pulled out the chair, and sat today. He had a folder of documents with him, physical ones, the kind the organization kept for internal circulation, and he opened it and began reading with the same focused quiet he apparently brought to everything. He did not say "You're still awake." He did not ask what Paul was working on. He did not perform the social transaction of explaining why he was there. He simply sat across from Paul in the archive room at midnight and read, and Paul looked at him for a moment, long enough to register that this was genuinely strange, and that he had no procedural response to it, and then looked back at his screen and kept working. 40 minutes passed. Maybe more. The building was completely silent except for the ambient hum of the ventilation system and the occasional turn of a page. Paul worked through 3 more reconciliation files. His coffee went from hot to warm to the specific temperature at which he always forgot to keep drinking it. It was the most companionable silence he'd had in years. The realization arrived without drama, the way the truest things did, quietly, between one line of data and the next, with no warning and no convenient place to file it. He did not say so. He closed the reconciliation file, opened the next one, and said nothing at all. Paul's suppressant protocol was not something he had arrived at casually. He had spent 3 years refining it, the specific brand, the precise dosage, the exact interval between applications that kept his omega biology at a functional, unobtrusive distance from his daily life. He had consulted 2 physicians and 1 specialist who worked exclusively with high-functioning omegas in professional environments. The protocol was airtight. It had never failed him at a client meeting, a high-pressure negotiation, or the kind of extended stress that would have cracked a less disciplined system entirely. In the 5th week at the Seo estate, it began failing him. Not dramatically. Not in any way that was visible to anyone else. Just, at the edges, in small and infuriating increments, the way a precise instrument drifts when something in the surrounding environment changes without announcing itself. He noticed it first as a heightened awareness of the estate-sent landscape, the staff's varied designations, the lingering traces of Jiho's lieutenants who moved through the building during the day. Information his biology had always collected and that his suppressants had always muffled into background noise. The muffling was thinning. He adjusted his dosage on a Tuesday and told himself it was a calibration issue. Environmental load, elevated stress, the accumulated effect of 6 weeks of performance. There were legitimate clinical reasons for drift. He documented the adjustment in the small notes file he kept on his personal laptop under a folder labeled, prosaically, admin. He did not document what he already knew was the actual cause. Some data you collected and chose not to formalize. The problem, stated plainly and in the privacy of his own mind where no one could hear him be this honest, was Jiho's scent. It had been present since the first day, ambient, architectural, threaded through the estate the way the ventilation system was threaded through the estate, simply part of the building's atmosphere. In the first weeks Paul's suppressants had handled it efficiently. Catalogued, filed, dismissed. Somewhere around the 5th week his omega instincts stopped dismissing it and started paying attention in the specific, focused way that bypassed cognitive override entirely and went straight to something older and considerably less reasonable. Amber. Cold iron. And underneath both of those, underneath the power and the control and the deliberate impermeability, something quieter. Something that his body, without consulting him, translated with mortifying consistency as safe. Paul resented this with a ferocity that was, he recognized, disproportionate to the stimulus and therefore diagnostic of something he was not going to diagnose. He was not safe here. This was a calculated arrangement inside a criminal organization with active internal threats and a succession crisis and a cousin who had been embezzling through a real estate shell for at least 2 years. The word safe did not belong anywhere in this building. His nervous system was malfunctioning, and he was going to fix it with a dosage adjustment and rigorous intellectual discipline, and that was the end of the matter. This position was not improved by the fact that Jiho, in the 5th week, had developed an apparent habit of existing in whatever room Paul was working in, not intrusively, not conversationally, just present in the way large, quiet things were present, occupying space with a density that Paul's adjusted suppressants were no longer processing at the rate they should have been. The social event was a syndicate quarterly gathering, a private function at a members-only venue in Hannam, attended by the organization's senior figures, 3 allied families, and the specific subcategory of sharp-eyed observers who attended events like this specifically to read the room for weakness. Paul dressed carefully. Dark burgundy this time, fitted, the kind of clothing that communicated deliberate choice rather than assignment. He reviewed the guest list in the car and identified 7 people whose body language he would need to monitor and 4 whose financial signatures he had already found in the archive and who therefore could not be allowed to suspect he recognized them. The venue was the opposite of the family dinner, louder, more crowded, the air thick with competing scents and the specific social performance of people who lived in dangerous proximity to each other and needed to appear unconcerned about it. Paul moved through it with practiced ease, at Jiho's side in the way they had established over 3 weeks of appearances, close but not clinging, warm but not demonstrative, the body language of a bond that was comfortable enough to require no proof. He was doing well. He knew he was doing well because 2 of Jiho's lieutenants had, in the past hour, directed their conversations subtly away from topics they would not discuss in front of a trusted Omega companion, which meant the performance was reading as credible at operational depth. And then Seo Day One appeared across the room with 2 men Paul didn't recognize and a smile that had the specific quality of a calculation presenting itself as pleasantry. He felt Jiho register it, not through any visible movement, but through the almost imperceptible shift in his stillness that Paul had learned, over 5 weeks, to read as alertness. Jiho turned toward him. Slightly, naturally, the way you turn toward someone you were with. He reached up and adjusted Paul's collar, which did not need adjusting, his fingers brief and certain against Paul's neck. Then he leaned close, his voice low enough that it existed only in the space between them. "Relax," he said. "I won't let anyone touch you." Paul did not relax. His spine remained exactly as straight as it had been. His expression remained exactly as composed. His suppressants continued their inadequate performance. But something in his chest, some small, specific, structural thing, shifted without permission, like a door easing a fraction off its latch. He did not look at Jiho. He looked across the room at Day One and kept his face entirely neutral and thought, with grim and exhausting clarity, that his dosage adjustment was not working. Nothing about this was working. He smiled at Day One across the room and let Jiho's hand stay where it had settled, lightly, at his back. He would deal with the rest later. He found it on a Wednesday, at 11:14 p.m., between a decommissioned vendor contract and a folder of correspondence that had been archived under the deliberately uninteresting label Administrative Legacy, Pre-Reorganization. Paul had been working through the pre-reorganization files for 3 days because they were the one section of the archive that didn't fully reconcile with the organizational timeline he had constructed, and Paul did not leave gaps in timelines. He was tired in the specific, functional way he had been tired since arriving at the estate, the kind of exhaustion that lived behind the eyes and didn't interfere with the work because the work was the thing keeping everything else manageable. He opened the folder. He found the contract. It took him approximately 90 seconds to understand what he was reading. Another 30 to verify it against 3 separate cross-references, because he was Paul Carson and Paul Carson did not accept the first answer when the first answer was this. The contract was an internal enforcement document, the SAO organization's formal record of Daniel's debt, the timeline of accumulation, and the scheduled call-in date. Standard procedure. He had seen versions of this document before in the archive. What was not standard was the date. The debt had been callable for 4 months before Paul received that 2 a.m. phone call. The enforcement timeline showed the call-in date had been pushed back 3 times, small administrative delays, each one documented with the kind of procedural language that would satisfy an auditor who wasn't looking for it specifically. Paul was always looking for it specifically. He pulled Daniel's original file. There, attached at the back, was a printout of an academic paper, Paul's own work, published 2 years ago in an international financial analysis journal, his name and institutional affiliation printed cleanly at the top. It was annotated. Not extensively. 3 or 4 marginal notes in handwriting Paul had seen on internal documents for 6 weeks and recognized immediately. Jiho's handwriting. Paul sat very still for a moment. Then he closed the folder, closed his laptop, and went to find Jiho's SAO. The main office was on the 2nd floor, and the light was on. It was almost always on at this hour. Paul had registered this without examining it, the way you registered the habits of people you were trying not to pay too close attention to. He knocked once. The door opened as if Jiho had been expecting him, which perhaps he had. The man had an unnerving instinct for inevitability. Jiho was at his desk, jacket off, one lamp burning. He looked at Paul in the doorway and something in his expression did the thing it occasionally did when he thought no one was measuring it, shifted, slightly, into something less composed. Paul walked in. He set the enforcement contract and the annotated paper on the desk between them. He did not say anything. He had found, over 6 weeks, that silence was Jiho's primary language and that meeting him in it was the most direct form of confrontation available. Jiho looked at the documents. He looked at Paul. He did not reach for them. "You knew," Paul said. Not an accusation. A statement of established fact, delivered the way he delivered financial findings, clean, sourced, requiring no emotional emphasis because the evidence was sufficient. "Yes," Jiho said. "For 4 months before the call-in. You delayed enforcement 3 times. "Yes." "Not for Daniel's sake." "No." Paul looked at him. "You read my work. 2 years ago." Jiho's voice was level, but it had the quality of something being said carefully, chosen rather than automatic. A paper on structural fraud detection in closed financial systems. The methodology was unlike anything I'd seen from someone at your career stage. I had your name in a file before your brother borrowed a single one from this organization. The room was very quiet. Paul processed this with the same systematic attention he applied to everything, working through the implications in sequence, and the implications were significant and numerous and landed with the particular weight of information that retroactively rearranges the shape of everything preceding it. Jiho had not trapped him. There was no trap. There had been a debt, Daniel's debt, real and valid, and there had been a man who had read Paul's published work and recognized something in it and then, with the patience of someone accustomed to playing long games, waited to see if the geometry of circumstance would eventually create an opening. It had created an opening. Jiho had made it slightly wider and then stood back. The distinction was enormous. Paul was furious at how enormous it was. "You could have approached me directly," Paul said. "Offered a consulting contract. A standard professional arrangement. You would have said no. You don't know that." Jiho looked at him with the steady, undeceivable attention that Paul had spent 6 weeks failing to get used to. "You built your entire career on independence," he said. "You don't work inside structures. You audit them from outside and leave before they can ask you to stay." A pause. "I know your work, Paul. I've read everything you've published. You would have said no." The use of his first name, unannounced, unqualified, landed somewhere it shouldn't have. Paul held his ground. "So instead you waited for my brother to manufacture an emergency that left me no options." "I waited," Jiho said, "for a door to open. I didn't manufacture anything." "You kept it open." "Yes. That's not nothing." "No," Jiho said quietly. "It isn't." They looked at each other across the desk and the documents and 6 weeks of everything neither of them had said. "I wanted to work with someone real," Jiho said. His voice was even, but beneath the evenness was something careful, something that had the texture of honesty being handled for the first time without its usual protective casing. "Someone who would actually see what was here and tell me the truth about it. I didn't expect." He stopped. The sentence hung in the space between them, unfinished and entirely legible. Paul knew what came after "I didn't expect." He knew it with the same certainty he knew balance sheets and behavioral patterns and the financial signatures of people trying to hide what they valued. He knew it because the same unfinished sentence existed somewhere in his own chest, had been living there for weeks in the gap between what this arrangement was and what it had become. He did not say so. Jiho did not finish the sentence. Neither of them moved toward the door. The lamp burned. The building held its silence around them. Outside, Seoul continued its indifferent, luminous sprawl, and in the main office of the Seo estate 2 men stood on opposite sides of a desk and an incomplete sentence and did not leave. They did not kiss. The tension was more honest than resolution would have been. Some truths were more true for remaining unresolved, suspended at the precise moment before they became something you couldn't take back. Paul picked up his annotated paper from the desk. He looked at Jiho's marginal notes one more time, 3 words in the margin beside his methodology section, underlined once, "This one's real," and then he tucked it under his arm. "Good night," he said. Jiho said nothing. But he watched Paul walk to the door with an expression that had stopped pretending to be neutral. Paul did not look back. He was already deciding what to do with the truth, and he needed to be alone to do it honestly. The approach came on a Thursday afternoon, which Paul would later note was either very calculated or very careless. Thursday being the one day of the week when Jiho left the estate for a standing external meeting and the building operated at reduced alpha presence. Calculated, then. Someone had done their homework. He was in the East Wing reading room, working through a subsidiary compliance review, when Hyunjin appeared in the doorway with an expression Paul had not seen on him before. Controlled, as always. But underneath the control, the particular stillness of a man who had just been handed a problem that fell outside his operational remit. "You have a visitor," Hyunjin said. "He says it's personal." The man waiting in the ground floor reception room was not Seo Day One. Paul had half expected Day One. The cousin was the obvious vector, the one Paul had been tracking since he identified the shell account in week 2. But the man in the chair was older, softer in appearance, with the careful presentation of someone whose danger was entirely administrative. He introduced himself as a representative of the Seo family's eastern branch, offered a name Paul didn't recognize, and placed a slim envelope on the table between them before Paul had sat down fully. "We'll keep this brief," the man said. "We're aware of the nature of your arrangement with Jiho Seo. We're also aware of the scope of your access to the organization's financial records." A pause, measured and deliberate. You've been doing work that certain members of the family find concerning. Paul looked at the envelope. He did not touch it. Concerning to whom? To people who believe the organization's future would be better served by leadership with a different approach. The man's voice was pleasant and entirely without warmth, the way certain financial instruments were technically functional and practically predatory. Inside that envelope are documents, original records, pre-reorganization, that would give the family council sufficient grounds to remove Jiho Seo from consideration for succession entirely, independently of the inheritance clause. He let this settle. We're not asking you to do anything with them, only to have them, and to be available to confirm, if asked by the council, that the financial irregularities they document are consistent with what you found in your audit. Paul said nothing. In exchange, the man continued, your brother's debt is dissolved through our branch. Not settled, dissolved. No record. You leave this estate tomorrow with a clean slate and a letter of professional commendation from a family representative, which I understand would be useful for your career in Seoul. A small, practiced pause. You have 24 hours. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and left the envelope on the table. Paul sat alone in the reception room for 3 minutes after the door closed. Then he picked up the envelope, without opening it, and went back upstairs. He did not open the envelope that night. He put it on his desk and looked at it and did not touch it again, because he already knew what was inside and examining the contents would constitute engagement with an offer he had not yet decided about, and Paul did not make decisions by accident. Instead he sat at his window with soul burning below him and did something he almost never did. He thought about himself. Not tactically. Not analytically. Not in the productive, forward-facing way he usually processed information about his own situation. He sat with the question the Eastern Branch representative had essentially asked, what do you actually want, Paul Carson, and what are you actually doing here? And he let it be a real question instead of a variable to be optimized. He had come here for Daniel. That was the origin, the stated purpose, the clean contractual frame around everything that had followed. 3 months, and then a clean exit, and then back to the life he had built on the foundational principle that he needed no one's world but his own. He examined that principle now with the same attention he had given Jiho's financial records, looking not for what was there but for what was conspicuously, carefully absent. What was absent was this. Paul could not locate, anywhere in his honest accounting of the past 10 weeks, a version of himself that was still simply here for Daniel. He was here because the work was real and the problem was genuinely complex and he had not felt this intellectually alive in years. He was here because somewhere in the archive of Jiho Seo's financial decisions was a portrait of a man spending himself quietly on behalf of people who would never know it, and Paul had been raised to believe that the truest thing about a person was what they funded when no one was watching. He was here because of 40 minutes of shared silence in a basement archive room, and a hand at his back that his suppressants had failed to process correctly, and an unfinished sentence that had been living in his chest for a week like a splinter he could not locate cleanly enough to remove. He was here because he had, without authorization, without intention, and with considerable personal inconvenience, begun to give weight to whether Jiho Seo was all right. He looked at the envelope. He picked it up, unread, and went to find Jiho. Jiho was back by 10. Paul knocked on the main office door and entered without waiting. He had stopped waiting after the 3rd week, and set the envelope on the desk. He told him everything. The visitor, the offer, the timeline, the terms. He told it the way he delivered audit findings, sequentially, completely, without editorializing. Jiho listened without moving. When Paul finished, he looked at the envelope for a long moment, then back at Paul with an expression that had the quality of something being recalculated. You didn't open it, Jiho said. No. A pause. You didn't have to bring this to me. Paul met his eyes. Outside the window, Seoul did what Seoul always did. Burned on, indifferent, brilliant, asking nothing of anyone. I know, Paul said. The silence that followed was different from their other silences. It had weight and direction and the specific texture of something that had shifted permanently and could not be shifted back. Jiho looked at him the way he had looked at that marginal note in the archive. This one's real. Paul held his gaze and said nothing further. He didn't need to. The envelope was on the desk, unopened, and they both knew what it meant. not as a tactical decision, not as a contractual obligation, but as the plainest, most unambiguous statement Paul Carson had made since walking through the Sayo estate's front door. He was no longer here for the contract. He was not entirely sure what he was here for yet. But it was not that. The contract arrived on his desk on a Monday morning, which was so administratively ordinary that Paul almost missed the weight of it. A single document, placed there while he was in the archive. He found it when he came back upstairs at noon, sitting in the center of his cleared desk with the quiet finality of something that had always been inevitable. The original agreement, 3 months old, the paper slightly worn at the fold lines from having been handled by more than one set of careful hands. At the bottom, beside Jiho's original signature, a second stamp had been added in red ink. Settled in full. Beneath it, a date. Today's date. Exactly 90 days from the night Paul had picked up a pen in a room with no natural light and signed his name without his hand shaking. He stood at his desk and read it twice. Not because he needed to, the document was unambiguous. His own audit trail had confirmed the debt's clearance 3 days ago when he'd been reconciling the final quarter's accounts. But because reading it twice was the kind of thing a person did when they needed a moment to locate their composure before proceeding. He found his composure. He folded the contract along its existing lines. He put it in the breast pocket of his jacket, against his chest, where the paper sat with the specific gravity of something that had cost him more than money to earn. Then he went to find Jiho. Jiho was in the main office. He was always in the main office at this hour, which was one of approximately 40 things Paul had learned about him over 90 days without intending to. He was standing at the window when Paul knocked and entered, not at his desk, which was unusual, and Paul noted this and said nothing about it. I received the contract, Paul said. Jiho turned from the window. He was in black, as always, jacket on, the deliberate composure fully assembled. But he had been standing at the window rather than working, which meant something Paul was not going to examine at length. Everything is in order, Jiho said. Daniel's debt is dissolved from our records. There will be no further contact regarding the matter. I know. I verified the reconciliation myself last week. Paul paused. The professional frame of the conversation had run its natural length. What remained on the other side of it was larger and considerably less structured. Thank you, he said. For the terms. For keeping them. Jiho looked at him. Something in his expression did the thing it had been doing more frequently in the past 2 weeks, the neutrality present but thinner, like ice in early spring, the ground beneath it visible and close. You kept yours, he said. That's what I agreed to. Yes. The word landed with the weight of everything neither of them said after it. Paul held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, once, with the clean finality of a meeting concluded, and left the office. He packed efficiently because he packed everything efficiently. It was one of the less complicated things about him. He had moved enough times in his life that the mechanics of departure were automatic, requiring no emotional overhead. Shirts folded. Laptop in its case. The small framed photo of him and Daniel from 3 years ago, before everything, wrapped in a soft cloth and placed on top. He was methodical. He was systematic. He was absolutely fine. He was midway through consolidating his archive notes onto an external drive when he became aware that Jiho was in the doorway. He didn't hear him arrive. Jiho moved through the estate like weather, present before you registered the change in pressure, but he felt the quality of the room shift in the way it always shifted when Jiho entered it. That particular gravitational adjustment Paul's suppressants had long since stopped pretending not to register. He did not look up. He continued transferring files. Jiho did not speak. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, which Paul knew without looking because he had learned the specific silence of Jiho standing with his arms crossed. It had a different texture than Jiho standing any other way, and he said absolutely nothing, and Paul kept packing because the only alternative was stopping, and if he stopped moving he would not be able to start again. He knew this about himself with the same certainty he knew balance sheets and behavioral patterns. He was a person who had always left before the leaving could be done to him, and the only way to execute a clean departure was to keep the momentum continuous from the decision to the door. He closed the suitcase. He snapped the latches. He picked up his laptop bag. The fourth embezzlement trail, the Mapo Shell account, he said, because apparently some part of him needed to be useful until the last possible moment. Day one is going to move on it in the next 30 days now that I'm leaving. The transaction pattern suggests he's been waiting for reduced audit pressure. Hyunjin has my notes. A pause from the doorway. I know, Jiho said. Just making sure. Paul. He looked up. Jiho was looking at him with the expression from the main office, thinner ice, visible ground, and for one unguarded moment Paul could see exactly what was underneath it, had been underneath it for weeks, and it was the most destabilizing thing he had witnessed in 90 days of living inside a criminal organization. More destabilizing than rival factions or inheritance clauses or his own failing suppressants. Jiho Seo was going to say something real. And Paul, who had survived everything this estate had produced, knew with absolute clarity that he could not stand here and hear it and still leave. Good night, Jiho, he said. Gently. The gentlest he had been with him in 90 days. He picked up his bag and walked out of the suite. He was up before dawn. The estate was quiet at that hour, the specific quiet of a large building holding its breath, and Paul moved through it with his roller bag and his laptop case and the contract folded in his breast pocket, his suppressants freshly applied in the clinical, disciplined way he had applied them every day of his adult life. His cab was booked for 6:15. He reached the corridor, the long, gold-lit hallway that had always felt more like a display case than a home, and the marble clicked under his bag's wheels in the silence, and he got to the door and put his hand on it. Jiho's palm hit the wall beside his head. Not violent. Absolute. The way a door locks. The way a verdict lands. Paul went still. The suppressants he had applied 40 minutes ago were already failing. Amber. Cold iron. Safe. His body saying the same thing it had been saying for weeks, louder now, undeniable in the silent corridor at 6 in the morning with the cab waiting and the contract in his pocket and 90 days of carefully maintained distance collapsing in the space between one breath and the next. He did not turn around immediately. He stood with his hand on the door and felt the full weight of the moment, let himself feel it, for once, without managing it into something smaller, and then he turned. Jiho was close. Both hands braced against the wall, bracketing the space around Paul without touching him, his jaw set, his eyes doing something Paul had no clean vocabulary for. Not possession. Not command. Panic. Quiet, structural, and real. From a man who Paul had never once seen afraid of anything. Who said you could go? Paul looked at him. His suppressants were gone. His eyes were bright and furious and honest in a way they had not been, perhaps had never been, in this building or anywhere else. 3 months of controlled distance burning off like morning fog in the full light of what this actually was. He was so tired of managing this into something smaller. Give me one reason, he said. Jiho gave him more than one reason. He didn't deliver them eloquently. He was not, Paul had learned over 90 days, a man who performed his emotions for an audience, not even an audience of one, not even at 6 in the morning in a gold-lit corridor with everything on the line. What he gave Paul instead was the specific, unadorned honesty of a man who had decided, somewhere in the night just past, to stop managing the distance between what he felt and what he said. He said, the audit work was not finished, and there was no one else he trusted to finish it. He said, Daewon's network ran deeper than Paul's current findings, and dismantling it cleanly required someone who understood both the financial architecture and the human cost of getting it wrong. He said, with the careful precision of someone choosing each word the way you chose footing on uncertain ground, that he had spent 2 years reading Paul's work before Paul walked through his door, and 3 months watching Paul be exactly who his work suggested he was, and he did not know what to do with the fact that this had become the most important thing in his life. But he knew with the same certainty he knew anything that letting Paul walk out of this building would be the first, genuinely irreversible mistake he had ever made. He stopped. The corridor held its silence around them. Paul looked at him for a long moment, at the set jaw and the unguarded eyes and the hands still braced against the wall, still not touching, still giving Paul every available exit while making absolutely clear that he didn't want him to take any of them. All right, Paul said. Jiho went very still. All right. I'm staying. Paul held up one hand, which silenced whatever Jiho was about to say next. On my terms. Which I'm going to give you now, and which you're going to agree to before I put my bag down. Are we clear? Something moved through Jiho's expression that in another man Paul might have called relief. We're clear, he said. Paul put his bag down on the corridor floor, not back toward the suite, just down, neutral, on the marble where it stood, and he looked at Jiho Seo, the most feared alpha in South Korea's criminal underworld, and he talked. His own work. Not the syndicate's auditor, not a contracted employee, not a role defined by anyone else's organizational chart. Paul would operate as an independent consultant, contracted on projects he approved, with the ability to decline any engagement he found professionally or ethically incompatible. His name on his own work. His professional reputation his own to build and protect. His own income. A market-rate consulting fee for every project, paid to his personal account, independently of anything else between them. Not a stipend. Not a household arrangement. A professional rate for professional work, because Paul Carson had never been kept and was not going to start now. His own autonomy. He would live at the estate because it was practical and because he was choosing to, not because the geography of the arrangement required it. He could leave for a week, a month, a professional engagement in another city, without it constituting a rupture. He was not a fixture. He was a person who was choosing, on a given day, to be here. Full transparency. Not selective briefings, not curated information, not the version of the syndicate's operations that Jiho decided an Omega companion needed to know. Everything. The active risks, the ongoing disputes, the full picture of what this organization was and what it was working toward. Paul had made his choice with incomplete information once, the night he signed the original contract, and he was not going to make the same structural error twice. And the last term, stated plainly, with the flat clarity of something Paul had needed to say since the first family dinner and had been carrying since. No one in this building, in this family, in this organization, including Jiho, would define what Paul was capable of, or what Paul was permitted to do based on his designation. He was an Omega. He was also the person who had found 4 embezzlement trails in 48 hours, dismantled a rival faction's approach with a single unreturned envelope, and rebuilt 3 years of corrupted financial records from the inside. If those two facts ever appeared to be in contradiction to anyone in the Seo world, the error was in their reading, not in Paul. He finished. The corridor was very quiet. Jiho looked at him throughout with the focused, complete attention he gave everything that mattered to him. He did not flinch at any of it. He did not negotiate, qualify, or ask for time to consider. He agreed to every condition with the same steady certainty with which he did everything, not quickly, not performatively, but with the weight of a man who had already decided before he was asked. It was, Paul thought, the most terrifying and clarifying thing he had ever witnessed. He picked up his bag. He walked back toward the suite. At the corridor's midpoint he stopped, without turning around, and said, "The cab. Cancel it." Behind him, he heard Jiho reach for his phone. 6 months later, Seo Daewon's network was gone. Not dramatically. Paul did not do things dramatically. It was dismantled through 3 sequential regulatory referrals, 2 internal restructurings, and a forensic audit report that Paul submitted to the Family Council with the kind of comprehensive, irrefutable documentation that left no interpretive room whatsoever. Daewon resigned from the Family Council on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday the Eastern Branch had quietly withdrawn its succession challenge. The inheritance clause, rendered functionally moot by Seo Changwon's formal endorsement of Jiho's leadership the previous month, was amended out of the organizational charter entirely. The grandfather had pulled Paul aside at a family gathering in the 4th month, studied him with those precise, heavy eyes, and said, "You're not what I expected." Paul had said, "I know." The old man had almost smiled. Close enough. The estate's legitimate financial structure took longer. Good reconstruction always did, because you were not just fixing numbers, you were building systems that could sustain themselves honestly, and honesty required more architecture than concealment. Paul worked through it methodically, project by project, with the focused satisfaction of work that was genuinely worth doing. Hyun-jin, by the 5th month, had stopped pretending to expect Paul to crumble at any point. He brought the coffee now without being asked and occasionally left documents on Paul's desk with brief handwritten notes that constituted, in Hyunjin's particular emotional vocabulary, profound expressions of collegial respect. Paul accepted them as such. Among Jiho's organization, Paul acquired a reputation that traveled faster than he would have chosen. The Omega who had walked into the estate owing 80 million won and left the books cleaner than any Alpha advisor in a decade. He did not encourage this framing. He did not discourage it either. Let people make sense of it however they needed to. He knew what had actually happened. He had done his work. He had done it well. That was always the point. On an evening in the 7th month, Paul was standing at the window of the estate. His window now, in the way windows became yours when you had watched the same skyline through them long enough that the light at different hours had become a kind of grammar you thought in. Soul burning below, gold and white and relentless, doing what it always did, asking nothing of anyone, making room for everything. He heard Jiho come in the way he always heard Jiho, felt the room shift, felt the particular gravity of his presence reorganize the space the way it always had, the way Paul had stopped pretending not to notice approximately 4 months ago. Footsteps quiet on the floor. The specific stillness of a man who had learned that Paul did not need to be approached, only joined. Jiho stood beside him at the window. He looked at the city. His hand found Paul's. No ceremony. No announcement. No performance of the gesture for anyone's benefit, including their own. Just Jiho's hand settling over Paul's on the windowsill with the ease of something that had been true for a long time and was only now being said plainly. Paul looked at their hands. He looked at the city. He did not leave. Not because he couldn't. The cab app was on his phone, his consulting contracts were his own, his exit was as available to him as it had ever been. He had made sure of that. He had written it into the terms himself. He stayed because he had looked honestly at everything this was, the difficulty and the danger and the man beside him who had never once tried to make Paul smaller, and he had chosen it. Staying, Paul had discovered, was not the same as being kept. Staying, when you were someone who had spent a lifetime leaving, was the bravest thing you could do. He turned his hand over beneath Jiho's and held on. Outside, Soul burned on. Indifferent, brilliant, making room. I really hope you enjoyed watching this. If you did, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who loves a good romance story. Drop a comment below telling me your favorite part of the story or what kind of story you want to see next. Thank you so much for watching and I'll see you in the next video.